I never meant to be anywhere near the attic stairs, but there she was, leaning against the doorway, the late afternoon sun catching strands of silver in her hair. "Most tenants never see this side of the house," she said, her voice calm, almost teasing, like she was sharing a secret meant only for me. Her smile was brief, just enough to make the corners of her eyes crinkle, and I noticed the way her fingers lingered on the doorframe, the subtle grace in the small movement. I had been fumbling with my keys, pretending to busy myself, but I couldn't help watching her. Every slight tilt of her head, the way her shoulders relaxed as she exhaled, it felt intimate, though we were strangers in a sense. I'm 24, barely scraping through my first real job, still figuring out life, and here she was, 45, confident, poised, and somehow fragile all at once. Her presence was heavy, not with force but with a warmth that seemed to pull at the edges of my chest. I realized my hands were clammy, though I had no reason to be nervous, except that she existed, and I wanted, absurdly, to measure my worth in her quiet attention. She stepped aside, gesturing for me to pass, and the air between us shifted. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, a mixture of something woody and soft, almost like sandalwood wrapped in cashmere. My fingers brushed hers as I stepped past, a deliberate accident, and I felt a small spark, a current that made my stomach hitch. She didn't pull away, didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at me, just long enough to make me wonder if she had felt it too. "You don't get many visitors up here," she said, her voice lower now, almost confessional, and my eyes darted around the small attic space, the angled ceiling, dusty beams, a solitary window filtering amber light. Everything was ordinary, yet her presence made it extraordinary. I wanted to say something clever, something to leave a mark, but all I could manage was a nod, which she seemed to accept with a small, knowing smile. She leaned against the banister, her hand tracing the polished wood almost absently. I wanted to ask what she was thinking, but I didn't. Instead, I let my eyes wander along her profile, the gentle slope of her cheek, the slight tension in her jaw, the way her lips parted just a fraction. I could hear my own heartbeat, the soft scrape of my sneakers against the worn floorboards, and the quiet hum of a radiator somewhere below. Everything else faded. "I've kept this side of the house mostly to myself," she said, glancing at the window. "But there are some things you only notice if you linger." Her words lingered longer than necessary, and I felt the weight of them pressing against the small space between us. For a moment, the world reduced to nothing but her warmth, her subtle vulnerability, the way she seemed to notice me noticing her. I wanted to reach out, touch her hand again, ask if this was something we both felt but wouldn't say. The tension wrapped around us like the dim light, soft but insistent. Then, just as my lips parted to speak, the attic door creaked open behind her. She froze, and so did I. The spell was broken, and yet in that pause, that fleeting, suspended moment, everything had changed. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I wanted to. After that first glimpse of the attic, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Not the kind of thought that drifts in the background, but the kind that settles in your chest, warm and persistent, like a candle refusing to go out. I told myself it was absurd, a tenant drawn to his landlady, but the way she moved, the way she carried herself, left an impression I couldn't erase. She had a past, I could tell. There was a kind of cautious elegance in her movements, a way of entering a room like she expected no one to notice, but secretly hoping they would. I imagined relationships that had left scars hidden beneath that composure, maybe marriages that ended quietly, friendships that fell away, choices she still regretted. And yet, she wasn't bitter. There was a trace of humor behind the restraint, a softness in her voice when she thought no one was listening. I, too, had my guard. Life at 24 feels half-lived in comparison to her years. I'd moved cities, drifting between apartments and odd jobs, feeling the weight of being young and unanchored. She seemed to have it all together, and maybe that's why I lingered on her presence, because she was steady where I was restless, sure where I was fumbling. It was obvious to me that this was risky. There was the age difference, sure, but there was also something subtler, social perception, the unspoken judgment of neighbors or friends if this escalated. More than that, the way she looked at me sometimes, lingering just a little too long, made me doubt myself. Did she see me as naive? As someone she could toy with? Or worse, as someone she might care about? That evening, she leaned over the counter while I was making coffee, ostensibly to point out a switch. Her shoulder brushed mine. I flinched slightly, but she didn't notice, or maybe she did and let it linger, a deliberate pause in the air. Her perfume, soft vanilla, cedarwood, wrapped around me in that tiny, stolen proximity. I felt the warmth of her hand on my arm as she gestured, subtle but electrifying. My fingers itched to touch back, to trace the line of her wrist, but I told myself to restrain it. "You've been quiet today," she said, tilting her head, eyes catching the light. Her gaze held me longer than necessary, and I suddenly felt like an open book with pages too raw to read aloud. "Something on your mind?" I swallowed. Words seemed clumsy, inadequate. "Just thinking," I muttered. A ridiculous understatement. She didn't press, only gave a small smile, the kind that said she already knew. She lingered in the kitchen, making her own cup of tea, yet never leaving me entirely. Every movement felt intentional. The brush of her hand against the counter, the faint bend of her elbow near mine, the way her scent seemed to follow her like a halo. I felt my heart thump in rhythms I tried to ignore, reminding me constantly that this was dangerous, thrilling, and completely real. I caught her watching me once, not like a landlord watching a tenant, but with the softness of someone who notices details. The way I stirred my mug, the tilt of my head when I hummed a forgotten tune. She smiled almost imperceptibly, and I wondered if she felt the same magnetic pull I did, the slow burn that neither of us dared name. Later, as she stepped back to leave, our hands brushed again. This time, neither of us moved away immediately. Just a pause, tense, fleeting, electric. A shared, unspoken acknowledgement that the space between us carried weight heavier than either of us admitted. I stayed rooted to the spot long after she'd gone, her scent lingering in the air, the memory of her presence pressing against my skin. I didn't move until the apartment door clicked shut behind her. Then, and only then, did I realize I'd been holding my breath. Something had shifted. It wasn't spoken, it wasn't named, but in that brief, suspended contact, a bond had quietly formed. A bond charged with curiosity, caution, and a slow, smoldering anticipation neither of us would admit aloud. Yet, the evening had that quiet, heavy feeling, like the air was waiting for something to happen. I was on the couch, pretending to read a book, but really, I was aware of every movement she made in the apartment, how her shoes whispered against the floorboards, how the hem of her skirt brushed her knees as she bent to pick up a dropped envelope. She didn't notice me watching, or maybe she did, and let me. My chest tightened every time her hand lingered near mine on the armrest. It was accidental, I told myself, a fluke of positioning. And yet the heat it sparked made my skin itch. Then my phone buzzed on the coffee table. A message from a friend. "Still heading out tonight?" I ignored it. She glanced at the phone anyway. Our eyes met, just for a second, and I caught the flicker of a smile, or was it amusement, in her gaze. The thought of someone discovering this tension between us, someone noticing how close we'd gotten, made my pulse jump. "Your phone," she said softly, reaching for it. Her hand brushed mine again, this time lingering a fraction longer than necessary. I pulled back slightly, embarrassed, though my fingers tingled with the memory of contact. I tried to concentrate on the book in my hands, but the words blurred. She was leaning over me, just enough that the scent of her perfume filled my nose, warm, woody, intimate. My heart hammered like it was trying to escape my chest, and I could feel her breath on my neck when she whispered something about the message. Something unimportant, but spoken close enough to make the world narrow down to the two of us. I dared a glance up. Her eyes were soft, yet sharp, as if she could see the small, frenzied thrum of my heartbeat. I wanted to tell her everything, how every look, every brush of her fingers made me feel simultaneously alive and terrified, but the words stuck somewhere in my throat. We froze for a heartbeat when the front door clicked. A visitor? A neighbor? I didn't move. She didn't move. Silence pressed into the room like a physical weight. Then, as quickly as it had come, it passed. The threat of interruption dissolved, leaving only the charged space between us. She turned back to me, closer than before, our knees brushing under the coffee table. Her hand rested near mine, not quite touching, but the nearness made it impossible to ignore. I swallowed, trying to force calm into my voice. You don't have to stay here, I managed, though my words felt ridiculous. Her smile was small, patient, knowing. I want to, she said, simple and unguarded. She leaned slightly, and my breath caught, just a whisper's distance from her lips. I thought about the absurdity, the danger, the judgment, and yet I didn't pull away. Time seemed to suspend. A glance. A shift. A shared intake of breath. My hand twitched, caught in the gravity of wanting to close the space. She tilted her head, and for a moment I thought we would, just maybe, let everything fall into place. But then she paused, just short of the inevitable, and drew back fractionally. Still, the air between us remained charged, electric. Our fingers almost touched, and we were closer than we'd ever been, closer than either of us could rationally allow. The tension pressed against us both, a fragile, intoxicating thread, and neither of us spoke. But we didn't move apart either. In that suspended moment, I realized something unarguable. Distance was impossible now. Whatever hesitation we carried, whatever rules the world expected us to follow, had already begun to crumble. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding myself together until that evening, until she stepped into the living room wearing that soft, worn cardigan that smelled faintly of jasmine. The sight of her, the way she moved through the dim light, made my chest constrict as if it were trying to remind me I was alive in the most unbearable way. You've been avoiding me, she said suddenly, her voice low, almost a whisper, though the words carried an edge I hadn't expected. I looked up, startled, caught in the act of pretending that my distracted glances at the window were innocent. I haven't, I stammered, though I knew she could see through the lie. Her eyes softened, but there was a fire in them now, a quiet insistence that demanded honesty even before the words came. I wanted to tell her everything, the way my thoughts chased her after I left the apartment, the way my fingers ached for the smallest brush of her hand. But I couldn't. Instead, I felt the swell of frustration and longing rise in me, unbidden, impossible to control. She stepped closer, and I could feel her presence before I even registered it fully, the warmth of her body brushing mine, the faint catch of her breath near my ear, the subtle scent of her perfume that made the room spin. I wanted to lean into her, to close the impossible distance, but a tangle of fear and hesitation pinned me still. Why do you look at me like that? She asked, tilting her head slightly, one hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her fingers lingered longer than necessary near her cheek, as if inviting me into that intimate space while daring me to come closer. My throat tightened. My voice caught. I couldn't finish. Instead, I reached out almost instinctively, my hand hovering near hers before retreating, caught between longing and self-restraint. Her eyes followed the motion, sharp and knowing, and I felt my pulse hammer in my ears. You don't have to say it, she whispered. I already know. That single line, soft yet resolute, made the air between us heavy, like the pause before a storm. My stomach twisted with a mix of relief and panic. She leaned slightly against me, just enough to let me feel the curve of her shoulder against mine, and my rational mind screamed that this was madness, that we were stepping off the edge. But the pull was undeniable. I wanted to close the distance, to feel the warmth of her mouth against mine, the soft press of her hand in mine, the intimate knowledge of a heartbeat shared. Every instinct, every nerve in my body screamed for it. Her gaze held me, steady and demanding, and I felt the weight of unspoken confessions pressing between us. I could smell the faint warmth of her skin, see the subtle rise and fall of her chest beneath the cardigan. My hand twitched, as if trying to bridge the impossible, and I felt her lean just a fraction closer. The room shrank to the two of us. Breaths mingled, eyes locked, and the tension became almost unbearable. Then she whispered my name, low, deliberate, close enough that I could feel her lips against the shell of my ear, and I realized there was no turning back. Not really. The world outside had disappeared. And just as our faces drew impossibly close, as the space between us narrowed to the whisper of a kiss, the front door opened with a sudden, jarring click. We froze. Everything suspended in that heartbeat. The spell was broken, or maybe it had only just begun. The door clicked shut behind her, and for a moment, the apartment felt impossibly small. My chest was still tight, adrenaline thrumming in my veins from the near kiss earlier. But now, there was a new, unspoken weight between us. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice low, hesitant, but unshakably serious. I froze, every nerve alert, waiting for the revelation. My fingers brushed the edge of the coffee table, restless. She swallowed, her throat moving in that subtle way that made my heart skip. "I know why you've been avoiding me." My stomach dropped. What do you mean?" Her eyes softened, but her hand trembled just slightly as it rested against the wall for support. "I saw your messages last week," she admitted. "You were thinking about someone else. I thought you weren't interested, thought I was imagining things." For a moment I couldn't speak. Heat and shame battled with desire and relief. I wanted to step forward, to bridge the distance between us, but my body seemed caught between fleeing and collapsing into her arms. "I wasn't," I started, but she raised a hand, stopping me gently. Her palm was warm, a small, deliberate weight against mine. I felt the pull of her touch, almost electric. "I know," she said. "I shouldn't have looked. But now we both know. And that makes everything different." She leaned slightly closer, enough for our knees to brush under the coffee table. The movement was casual, but the proximity made my chest tighten. My fingers itched to find hers, to hold on, but I hesitated. The room was quiet except for our breaths. My eyes tracked the curve of her shoulder as she shifted, the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the small tremor in her hand as she moved it closer, almost touching mine. Every instinct in me told me to act, to cross the line we'd skirted for weeks. But reason held me back, even as desire pressed insistently forward. "I thought I was protecting myself," she whispered, leaning slightly so her hair brushed the side of my face. I could smell her faint perfume, jasmine and wood, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "But maybe I was protecting you too." Her words were simple, but the weight behind them made the air heavy. I wanted to say something clever, something that would reassure her, but my throat tightened. Instead, I just let my gaze linger, memorizing the way her lips parted slightly, the tension in her jaw, the tiny hesitations in her movements. We stood there, caught between confession and hesitation, between desire and caution. My hand twitched, hovering closer to hers, but I didn't move. She didn't either. Every inch we hadn't crossed felt like a taut wire, ready to snap under the slightest touch. Then she stepped closer, almost too close, so that the warmth of her body brushed mine. I felt her breath catch in that fraction of a second when our hands hovered within reach. It was intoxicating, maddening, and terrifying all at once. "I can't stop thinking about this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, so close I felt it against my ear. "About you. About us." I wanted to pull her into my arms, to close the distance once and for all, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I let my hand linger near hers, the air between us charged with everything we weren't saying. And in that silence, in that closeness, a decision formed, unspoken but undeniable. Whatever fear we carried, whatever rules or judgments, was about to be tested. Because we couldn't walk away now. Not without crossing that line. The apartment felt smaller than ever, every shadow and beam of light stretching the space between us until it seemed impossible to breathe. She stood just a few inches away, her shoulder brushing mine lightly, but enough to make the world tilt. My chest ached, a mixture of desire and fear, every heartbeat loud in my ears. "I don't know if I should," I began, my voice tight, words catching in my throat. She lifted a hand and brushed a strand of hair from my face, slow and deliberate, her fingers trembling just slightly. "Stop thinking," she whispered, voice low, teasing, dangerous. "Just feel." The air between us thickened, each breath mingling, each glance heavier than the last. Her eyes searched mine, unflinching, and I realized she was offering me something I hadn't dared hope for, the truth of her longing, laid bare and unguarded. I swallowed. Every instinct screamed to step closer, to close the distance I'd spent weeks resisting. But hesitation lingered, the ever-present shadow of doubt, of age, of perception, of what it meant to cross this line. And yet I couldn't stop myself. My hand hovered near hers, trembling, almost brushing her fingers, and she leaned just a fraction toward me. The warmth of her body, the faint scent of jasmine and wood, the softness of her voice, everything pressed against my senses like a magnet. "I can't pretend any more," she said softly, eyes glistening, lips parted as if inviting confession. "I shouldn't, but I can't." Her words broke through the last thread of restraint I had left. I reached out, fingertips grazing hers, and the contact was electric, fragile, yet undeniable. She leaned closer, and I felt the curve of her shoulder against mine, the tilt of her chin almost brushing my own. Our breaths mingled, shallow and quick, as if the apartment itself was holding its breath. "I've wanted this for weeks," I admitted, voice low, raw, almost trembling. "But I didn't know if you—" "I did," she interrupted, a small, almost mischievous smile curling her lips. "I've known." Time seemed to stop. Every fear, every hesitation, dissolved in that moment of truth. We were there, just inches apart, heartbeats sinking, every nerve screaming for closeness. And yet, it was messy, human, fragile. Not a perfect romance, but something real and undeniable. I let my hand linger on hers, then slowly slide up to rest lightly against her forearm. She leaned in fully, until our foreheads almost touched, and the warmth between us became unbearable. Our voices dropped to whispers, confessions carried on breaths that trembled, unsteady and urgent. "I don't care about anything else," she said finally, voice breaking slightly. "Not the rules, not the judgment. I just—" Her words trailed off, unfinished, heavy with meaning. I nodded, understanding completely. "Me too." And in that moment, the tension, the longing, the weeks of near misses, fear, and hesitation, all of it, found clarity. We didn't need words anymore. The unspoken truths settled around us, raw and human. We weren't perfect, we weren't ready for anyone's approval, but we understood each other fully. She exhaled, a soft, shuddering breath against my cheek. I mirrored it, letting the room dissolve around us, leaving only the warmth, the closeness, and the certainty of what we had just chosen. The decision was made. Desire won, not without fear, not without hesitation, but won nonetheless. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that finally feels safe after weeks of tension and near misses. We didn't speak at first, didn't need to. Our fingers intertwined naturally, small but deliberate, as if confirming silently that this choice, this closeness, was ours and ours alone. She leaned her head against my shoulder, light and steady, and I rested mine atop hers. The warmth of her hair against my cheek, the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her breath, made every lingering doubt, every hesitation, dissolve like fog in sunlight. I could feel the subtle tremor of her hand in mine, the softness of her skin, the unspoken acknowledgement that we had both waited too long to arrive here. "I never thought," she murmured, voice low, almost hesitant, "that it could feel like this. Like being exactly where I should be." I shifted slightly, pulling her a little closer without thinking, letting my lips brush the top of her head in a gentle, grounding kiss. "Neither did I," I admitted, heart still racing. "But I'm not letting it go now. The age gap, the doubts, the judgment of the world outside, all of it seemed irrelevant here, in this small, amber-lit apartment." She rested against me fully now, her warmth seeping into mine, and I realized that what had been impossible in imagination was now real. Human. Fragile and messy, yes, but ours. We laughed softly at some unimportant memory, the sound light and unguarded, and I noticed how easy it was to exist together, finally free of hesitation. Her eyes found mine, glinting with quiet amusement and affection, and I let myself savor the simple perfection of it, the shared breath, the intertwined hands, the slow, deliberate closeness that required no words. I brushed a hand along her arm, memorizing the subtle lines, the gentle warmth of her skin, the slight shiver that came with my touch. She leaned into it, relaxed, and I realized this was the intimacy we had been chasing, not a grand declaration, not a perfect romance, but the messy, human closeness that fills all the spaces you didn't know were empty. Finally, she lifted her gaze to mine. "We'll figure it out," she whispered, a soft certainty underlying the vulnerability. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." I nodded, pressing my forehead lightly against hers, feeling the small pulse of connection in that simple contact. "Together," I echoed, knowing that word carried more weight than any promise, any careful planning could. We stayed like that for a long time, either speaking, both aware of the rare and delicate certainty between us. Every hesitation, every stolen glance, every trembling hand that had defined our slow burn was now quieted by this shared understanding that we were here, and it was enough. Eventually, I shifted slightly to tuck her closer, letting the soft folds of her cardigan brush against my chest. She exhaled, a warm, contented sound, and I felt the tension of weeks melt entirely. We weren't perfect. We weren't free from life's complications. But in this moment, in this closeness, we were entirely human, entirely present, and entirely together. The dim light of the apartment wrapped us in a small world of our own making. Hands remained entwined. Foreheads pressed together. Breath mingled. Hearts slowly, surely sinking after all the storms of doubt and desire. And for the first time, it felt like home.